Hello, it's Chris Moles again, founder of Peaceworks University and author of the book, The Heart of Domestic Abuse. It's great to have you join me for this third video in our free workshop, Domestic Abuse and the Church. In this lesson, I'm going to outline the exact blueprint you need to see your church respond well. If you've ever been confused about how all the pieces of an intervention fit together, and more importantly, what goes into creating a successful intervention, then this video is for you. Maybe you're a pastor and you aren't comfortable with your past responses, or you're a counselor that isn't convinced that therapy alone is enough. So in this video, I'll show you how people helpers like you and me can see your church respond well to abuse. In video 1, we talked about how now is the right time to learn about domestic abuse and that you can have confidence in your responses. Then in video 2, we covered the first step to take so that you can understand the dynamics and impact of abuse. So if you haven't seen those videos, go back and watch them now and then come back to this one. Today, I'm going to build on what we already discussed by giving you the complete blueprint to see your church respond well to abuse. By the end of this video, you'll have more clarity about an intervention. More importantly, the team that your church can construct, and you'll see how everything begins to fit together. My hope is that this content will help you break free of some of the frustration. We've got a lot to cover today, so make sure you've got a pen and paper handy so you can take notes and follow along. Anytime you're trying to see your church respond well to abuse, things can get tricky. Because in the beginning, everything's new. Things like, who do I talk to? Where can I go for help? And all the temptations that accompany this work, like running ahead or running from, referring things out, or rushing to reconciliation. That's why it's so important to know the role that each person plays in an intervention. It's not easy, but it's worth it. That's why a response team is going to save you a ton of time and energy. Well, let's jump into today's content and learn a little bit more about the church's response. As we approach building responses to domestic abuse, I think it's important to remember that a uniform response, a system response, will more than likely prove unfruitful because cases are different and individuals are different. We want to respond as well as we can, but much of what we bring to the table, probably the most beneficial aspects of our interventions that we bring to the table, is wisdom and clarity. That's why it's important to continue our education, to learn about the dynamics and impact, to learn about those 4 foundational elements that we talked about in video 1, so that when we get to this piece today, this idea of developing a framework or a blueprint or here's some next steps for the church or the ministry, we understand that they're informed steps, not uniform steps. And what I mean by that is if we simply say, here's the 5 things you do every time you encounter a case of domestic abuse, we may actually do more damage. Yes, there are some things we should always do, and we'll talk about some of those things preventatively that we should put into place. There are some legal things that we may be obligated to do depending upon the severity and the extent of the violence. However, wisdom is still our greatest ally as we decipher what's best for the victim, what the victim wants in this particular case and instance, and what is best moving forward. In order to do that, though, as I've already said, we have to be educated. Anne Marie Hunter, founder of Safe Haven, puts it this way: faith leaders are first responders. You wouldn't send someone into a burning building as a first responder without training. So in the same way, faith leaders shouldn't have to respond to victims and survivors without critical training. The dilemma or the problem is that most of us coming out of seminary, coming out of Bible college, coming into pastoral ministry, even those of us coming into counseling ministry or small group ministry, we've not been trained on any aspect of abuse, in particular domestic abuse. And so even with this series, with the Domestic Abuse in the Church series, we're attempting to give you a foundation, some basic elements, an introduction to the process. But know that more education is needed, more information is needed, more training is needed, because when we begin to respond, and as you'll see in a moment, when we begin to engage at multiple levels with multiple people to help victims and confront perpetrators, the demand will increase. Once you become a safe place or a safer place, you will see more and more opportunities to minister. That's why it's important to take initial steps now so that you can be a safe place when a problem presents itself. Most ministries, most churches that we deal with on a regular basis or interact with who are asking for help are either in the middle of a very difficult situation that they're unsure how to handle, or they've mishandled or inappropriately handled situations in the past, and they're trying to repair that. Much better, much superior would be to be preventative by putting things in place that are going to serve victims and the church better. I say this is about laying the groundwork, and much of that has to do with conversations. So in these first two lessons together, you've learned about these four foundational elements that are present in abuse. You've learned about a much broader understanding of the dynamics and the impact. The question now is, what will you do with that information? And from my perspective, the best thing we can do is to have conversations, to begin to talk with our elders and leaders and deacons and small group leaders about these topics. Some of the topics the church should interact with, I believe, begin with aspects of definitions of abuse. Now, I don't think definitions are the end-all be-all. I don't think you're going to find a uniform definition because abuse is such a broader construct. But having those conversations will reveal to you where your leadership may be deficient. Does the pastoral team define abuse as only physical or sexual? Do they see it as an incident-based issue? Or have they learned that there's more coercive, controlling ways that perpetrators use? Have they learned that abuse is a construct? Do they understand the concept of patterns? This is really helpful. And as you've seen, hopefully, in videos 1 and 2, in lessons 1 and 2, necessary for building a response. I think the church should be talking and learning about the impact of trauma. We're learning a great deal of how trauma affects both the body and the heart, a person's emotions, choices, and thinking. And it's important that the church interact with individuals who have some experience in trauma. I personally believe that trauma is a natural or understandable response. If you're exposed to events and sin and wickedness that is outside the norm, I would expect you to respond in ways very similar to what trauma does. Learning more about that will help us grow in our compassion to victims. It will help us grow in our understanding and in our response. I think the bystander principle and the responsibility of men are a conversation we should be having as well at the leadership level. The bystander principle is just terminology that's used in anti-violence and anti-bullying language and campaigns that is really putting a burden on those outside of the violence, those outside of the situation. So what is the responsibility of good men, godly men in our church who are not perpetrating acts of violence? The unfortunate reality has been that the majority of men are not participating in domestic abuse, but they have remained silent as this epidemic has been happening all around them. They've been somewhat complicit in the idea of joking or laughing about incidences or believing some of the lies of the culture. It's really important that we have this conversation. What is the role of men, good men, godly men, in the face of such a silent, hidden epidemic? Next, we should be talking about building bridges between our community and service providers. Now, this is tricky because many of the folks in the work, service providers in domestic violence intervention and prevention, are somewhat hostile towards the church, and vice versa. And part of that is due to the ways in which we've responded to each other, and in particular, the ways in which the church has been perceived within, I think, particularly domestic violence shelters. The church has, in many communities, a bad reputation for trying to take women out of shelter and return them to an abusive husband. The church has a reputation for valuing marriage over people, and this is not lost on folks who work with victims day in and day out. Bridge building between our churches, ministries, and service providers is essential because one thing that advocates must admit, many of the women in particular coming to them for help have faith positions, specifically Christian positions. And so pastors, biblical counselors, leaders, Christian advocates are a resource that really are not available to a lot of victims. And so making those connections, we can actually be a tremendous benefit to them. And believe it or not, they can be a benefit to us. Shelters, advocates, community-based and law enforcement-based advocates have connections to resources and knowledge that we may not have. They're in the courts daily, so they understand the inner workings of your local judicial system. They have connection with things like legal aid and legal services. They offer support groups that can empower victims and help them process information. They also have access to resources like safety planning. There's a wealth of resources that we can take advantage of, and then we can bring the components of the gospel to bear on the lives of people who are suffering and people helpers who perhaps have not experienced a genuine relationship with Jesus. We also need to be talking about some of the basics in our response. How are we as a ministry, a church, going to handle a disclosure? I think that overall, disclosure is where we have mismanaged this process the most. A pastor receives a disclosure and does one of two things: believes or doesn't believe. And when I say doesn't believe, I mean a pastor will say, well, I need to get more information. I need to do an investigation. We really need to have a conversation about our role versus the role of law enforcement. Are we going to engage in investigation, or are we going to be more humble and engage in support? That's what a disclosure is about. Are you trustworthy? It's important that we have these conversations about how we receive a disclosure of abuse. It's also important we talk about intervention. Another huge misstep within the church is that well-meaning pastors and leaders who believe the victim, as they should, engage in inappropriate and dangerous interventions, immediately confronting the perpetrator without victim consent, without proper safety planning, and thus putting the victim in more danger. Attempts to bully the bully produce very quick and seemingly good results, but they end up harming victims in the long run. Interventions must be planned, and they must be done with victim consent and proper safety planning. They also should be done in gentleness, according to Galatians chapter 6. And then counseling and care. How are we going to respond to domestic abuse in our church by way of counseling and care? How are we going to properly refer or manage cases with victims and perpetrators? We're not going to do marriage counseling, hopefully. That would be ill-advised. And so as we separate them for counseling and care, how are we choosing the counselor? How are we working with the counselor? And who do we have or know that's equipped to do proper care for the victim and proper confrontation with the perpetrator? We should also consider having some theological conversations. I know these are not fun, but they're necessary. If we're going to be faithful in our response to domestic abuse, we have to have conversations regarding things such as divorce and remarriage. I'm not suggesting that any church change their current theological position. I'm not saying they have to write position papers that agree with my position. I am suggesting that we talk about it because most leadership teams have not discussed the ramifications of abuse as it pertains to their theology of divorce and remarriage. This would be a helpful conversation to have so that we're not just giving a knee-jerk reaction to a request, but we have thoughtful responses. We need to be talking about gender roles, in particular, our view of complementarity or egalitarianism. Wherever you fall on the spectrum creates a level of burden for you regarding how men in particular view their roles in the home. There are many within the Christian church who claim to be complementarian but hold to a more patriarchal view and oppressive view of the scriptures. This needs to be confronted, clearly articulated, and the pastors and leaders need to be on board with confronting men who abuse power in the home. Speaking of oppression, have we even talked about our theology of oppression? Many churches in the West, primarily those who exist in what would be called a majority culture, have never been asked to think about oppression, whether it be at the nationalistic, the state, the corporate, or the individual level. We're talking here about individual aspects of oppression, but it's helpful to put it in a larger framework, and the Bible gives us great narratives to unpack that. In particular, people in power using or abusing that power to harm others. Have we talked about it? And have we balanced it with this next point, our theology of suffering? I love a theology of suffering, but we have seen many churches embrace a theology of suffering without understanding concepts of oppression. Forcing or requesting that victims remain in situations in the name of suffering when the church's responsibility is to intervene in these cases. That not all suffering is intended to be beneficial, and that some suffering, that's suffering that's avoidable, should be avoided, and that the church should intervene when someone's using power to control. And then lastly, the gospel of peace. I bring this up because many of the churches we work with have seemingly lost the notion of peace. Not conflict resolution, which is important, but the Prince of Peace, bringing the gospel of peace within a kingdom of peace to people, calling them to peace, so that we, as much as it depends upon us, we can live at peace with others. The centrality of peace in the New Testament and how we can be those type of people, those peacemakers in our communities. As we're crafting responses, if churches are first responders, as we've opened up with today, what might be some of the key elements they should consider adding? So obviously we should be having conversations based around many of those topics we just talked about, but they should also consider adding some things to their current ministry structure. Number one, I think churches should consider adding public statements. The leadership should condemn domestic violence as sin publicly. I recently read, I think it was the Lifeway study, said that I think it was in the 40%, maybe 42%, something like that, of pastors believed they had mentioned abuse from the pulpit. But when compared with Christian survivors, 95% reported they never heard the word abuse from the pulpit. I've been in church a lot, most of my life, and been around the church world for a long time. And of the two statistics, I happen to side with the survivors. I have rarely heard the term abuse used from the pulpit. Now, granted, times are changing. By God's grace, we're becoming more and more aware. I think public statements are beneficial. My one warning about public statements is be prepared. This is why we're having this conversation at this point. When you go through material like the 4 foundational elements, dynamics and impact, and you learn about the severity and the significance of abuse, the temptation, rightfully so. I don't want to sound like it's a negative. Rightfully so, you want to address it and address it publicly, which I think is wise. My caution is when public statements are made, be prepared for an increase in disclosures. And so I want you to be prepared before you make a public statement. That's why it's important to have these conversations, to start working through some of your policy, some of your theological issues, some of your approaches, as we're going to talk about here in a second, some of your team members, because public disclosure condemning abuse, which should happen, will increase disclosures. You will see an increase because you will present yourself as trustworthy. And by the way, you want to prove that fact. You want to be trustworthy. We're already preaching sermons. Usually most pastors I know are covering marriage once a year, even if they're an expository, teaching from expository position, they're covering that topic. There's a perfect opportunity to talk about abuse. Some of the tricky passages that men have twisted to justify abuse, like 1 Peter 3 or Ephesians chapter 5, are good opportunities to confront those myths. And then, of course, special events and seasons in life, like October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, may provide an opportunity for you to speak from the pulpit. Safety. Safety is the driving force behind any coordinated response. So the church really should be a safe place and should establish safety protocols. So we should know our first contacts. Who do we reach out to first when there's a disclosure? We should have safety planning materials available. If you're a larger church, maybe you have a counseling team, maybe making sure that one of your female counselors has gone through safety planning training with the local shelter. If you have a team, which I highly recommend, then each team member should be committed to fulfilling their role to ensure the safety of those who are serving. Safety should be our number one priority as we're moving forward with our responses. Awareness and engagement with service providers. Many decisions in the church regarding abuse have been made in ignorance. I like to think the best about the church, and I think not all. There have been some very sinister things happen in the church, but most of the people that we've worked with, mistakes were made in ignorance. Most of the mistakes that I've made in interventions have been done without all the information. It's important to offer continuing education as the primary players in leadership change often. I've come into churches and trained their entire elder board. Within 3 years, there's a whole new group of people. Consider working with community agencies such as shelters, advocates, behavioral health centers, law enforcement, and the courts for help and partnerships. They can provide some of the initial training and awareness, or partner with ministries like us, like PeaceWorks, to help train your church in the dynamics and impact, to do a broader and deeper dive into what we're really looking for and how to respond. Next, freely challenge policies, procedure, and non-nuanced theological positions. There has to be someone speaking prophetically within the life of your church. I would prefer that come from a leadership position. I think it carries weight and things tend to get done when one of the leaders, a counseling pastor, a small group leader, somebody who has a voice, challenges some of the policies. Some of the established attitudes, norms, and practices that you see now to be ineffective or dangerous should be addressed and adjusted. Some intervention is necessary at the institutional level and not just with individuals. And so it's important that we raise awareness when possible by challenging some of the policies, procedures, and non-nuanced theological positions. Some examples might be we've worked with churches who had a very rigid church discipline process on divorce, but when addressing issues of abuse, have disciplined victims for divorcing their abusive partners. They've recognized that the system had failed these individuals and that they could not have a rigid one-size-fits-all disciplinary process for divorce. They had to have and add elements of wisdom and evaluation to that process. Some aspects of procedures, such as always counseling couples together. We've worked with churches that their paperwork literally requires spousal permission to engage in counseling at the church, limiting the victim, limiting their safety by, in cases of abuse, informing the abuser of private meetings, or requiring couples counseling, which puts the victim also in danger. When possible, and this is a key point moving forward, When possible, try to build a multidisciplinary team. This brings together as many relevant voices as possible. I love team building and have found the most effective responses to domestic abuse that I've been a part of have occurred in the context of a team. Consider the value of having advocates, counselors, batterer interventionists, law enforcement, pastors, and attorneys around the table. This may not be possible within every church. I know for myself, I pastor a small church. I'm part of a larger multidisciplinary team in our community. I value tremendously the input of our wonderful advocates, our law enforcement officers, and the attorneys that we partner with. Now, if you're a larger church, we've seen this function in larger church settings or multi-site church settings where a response team has been able to be built within the elders, church-based counselors, community-based counselors, law enforcement advisors, and attorneys, family law attorneys that are part of the larger church structure. Signing MOUs or waivers can help you have open conversations in closed meetings, obviously, about cases. It can help you build responses, and it can let you see things that perhaps you're not seeing in the case. I know I primarily work with perpetrators. Obviously, I'm not getting all of the information. A well-trained advocate gives me information that I can use in working with perpetrators. Information directly from the victim that I can then apply to the case. It also allows me to inform the advocate of any concerns that I have so that the victim can make proper adjustments in safety planning or add consequences or boundaries when appropriate. Make sure that your response is gospel-centered but victim-influenced. We are the church after all. The gospel is central to our process. So make sure that you're providing opportunities, both salvific and for sanctification, in your work. Advocates communicate the needs and desires of victims in order to shape our interventions, meaning I want victims to influence our response. Our goal is always to bring the gospel to bear, but we need the victim's input in order to do that effectively. And flexibility. One key aspect of team-based ministry is the ability to adapt based on team member observations. We use input to lessen our blind spots and improve our interventions. If you're a pastor or ministry leader and you have a hard time sharing, which let's face it, a lot of us do, this is going to be a difficult work for you to engage in. The temptations are going to be to run, to hide, to sweep it under the rug, or to get it done as quickly as possible. Team members hold your feet to the fire and keep you accountable to see the long game, the end result. We have to be flexible and allow our team members to provide adjustments so that we can minister effectively. I hope this has been helpful. This is one of those areas where conversation can change everything. Let's do a quick review of what we've learned today. Number one, churches must respond to the evil of domestic abuse, and they can do that in a variety of ways. We should consider how we're responding publicly, from the pulpit to what we're writing to our social media campaigns. We should consider how we're responding in our policy as well. Do we have written procedures? Have we engaged in policy making that considers domestic abuse? And practically, what's happening in our counseling rooms, our small group meetings, and who are we welcoming into the process to lighten the burden and to get more eyes on the situation? Number two, teams are a great way to share that burden and maintain accountability. I think once you begin to establish policy, procedure, practice, and team-based approaches, you'll see how everything fits together and the frustration will begin to alleviate. Most importantly, doesn't it feel good knowing that you should focus on this right now? That there's some steps that you can take before you find yourself in an intervention? Prevention is the best tool that a church or ministry has. If we are prepared, then we'll respond better. Now that these wheels are turning, these thoughts are churning in your head, I want to hear from you. I know you picked up a lot of ideas from this video, and now it's time to get started. So let me know what you think. What will your first steps be? If you're already connected to our Facebook group, The Safest Place, Domestic Abuse in the Church, then share a comment about the first steps that you're going to take. Maybe it's introducing your pastor or leadership team to materials like this. Maybe it's a board meeting where you discuss policies and procedures. Perhaps it's a sermon series in which you're going to address the issues of abuse. Or maybe it's implementing a curriculum like becoming a church that cares. Whatever you decide, taking the next step is important. Don't just sit on the information. Put it into practice. If you found this video helpful, would you be willing to share the link to the series with others? Let a friend know, and of course, share it with your pastor or ministry leader. In the next video, I'm going to show you your next steps. We're going to grow in our learning and our implementation. Speaking of learning, we've been hearing from a number of people who have questions about PeaceWorks University, and I'd love to see you in there. That is the next step for many of the folks watching this video series. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that program and how you can join in the next video. So if you're interested in moving forward and want to know how, you have to come to the next event. You have to join us in the next video. I'll lay it all out for you. Thank you guys for being part of video number 3 and this entire workshop. Your willingness to grow and engage in this area is beyond encouraging to me. And I do believe as we engage the church in this work, she will become the safest place on the planet. God bless.